So you might know them. The great philosophers were Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates. Now, we don't know much about Socrates other than what Plato wrote, and some folks might even think that Socrates was a narrative trick or a character developed by Plato to provide somewhat of a background or somewhat of a conversation partner for Plato to discover what his thoughts really were. But here's the idea. So Socrates came first, and he had some really important thoughts that were shared about how we could use a method of questioning to drive down to our deep-seated questions. And then questioning really fundamentally, what are the operationally defined terms that we're discussing here? You'll see this a lot in people who have debates online, is that they might be arguing semantics, right? That one person's using a definition here, and that's not the same as the person over here. They might be using the same word, but they define those terms differently. And what Socrates did, or at least Plato told us Socrates did, was that he really began to help people learn to question, learn to be skeptical, and learn to be very precise in how they defined what it was they were talking about. Plato had an idea that we're imbued, or we start off, our brain starts off, we're born with certain granted or inherited characteristics. Now, he didn't know anything about genetics, but he would say that people are born with certain positions. In Plato's Republic, he famously talks about Socrates saying that we should lie to people and tell them that they're born with 3 types of souls: a gold soul, a silver soul, or a bronze soul. That those are unearned, not like our, say, Olympic athletes who will earn them through meritocratic, excuse my language, performance, but that people were imbued and started out with that as their starting point. And that those souls that we were granted gave us different capabilities, different responsibilities to the community. If you haven't read Plato's Republic, go read it. It's phenomenal. It's a wonderful, wonderful consideration as to what is justice. It really talks about justice. If you are at all concerned with justice right now, and I think a lot of us are, it's a great place to go back and look where the Western world started to begin to say, well, what is fair? What is right? What is just? And how can we govern ourselves, right? What's the true level of governance over each other that's appropriate? So if you want to know about that, go read Plato's Republic. And he also started the academy, right? He started basically the way that we teach. I'm teaching you now, you're my student. He kind of set that up in his academy, and we followed ever since. One of his students was a man by the name of Aristotle. And Aristotle, like many of you will do, disagreed immensely with his teacher. And that's okay. It's okay to disagree with me. I want you to be skeptical of me. Just share how you are, and let's make sure that that's not your feelings that you're saying, but something that's true for everybody that we can really look at and say, okay, this will be true for everybody, not just my experience or my interpretation of something. And Aristotle disagrees with Plato about the idea that people are born with innate knowledge. And Aristotle suggests that people only learn what they're exposed to through their senses. We've got these 5 senses, and we'll cover those after we get through biology, but we only have these 5 senses. That's all we can do to see the world. And so Aristotle said that knowledge comes specifically through those 5 senses. He also was somebody who practiced what he preached. If you read about Aristotle, the guy was an absolute philologist. He loved learning, and he loved learning about learning, and he would investigate by using his body. He was investigating sea life, and he would go fishing, and he would classify these different animals, these types of animals that he found, and he made speculative assessments of them. But he wouldn't only go and talk to himself, he would then go and talk to fishermen and find out what the fishermen knew about the fish. Again, what a great way to do it. Instead of taking the anecdotal evidence just from himself, right? It's perfectly good to get hands-on and understand something by your own experience, but then also talking to people who have more experience, right? Aristotle wasn't a fisherman, so he went and talked to the fishermen about what it was like and what the sea creatures were like and how the world of the sea worked. He was investigating it through the senses. He was investigating it through other people's senses. And this is very important for us. Many years go by after the Greek philosophers, and the next philosopher we're going to talk about wasn't just a philosopher. And those philosophers weren't just philosophers, right? They were teachers, they were educators, they were great thinkers. The next man we come to is, I think he's my favorite. He might be my favorite, what I would call psychologist, because he was somebody who was intensely curious about human behavior, and he wanted to classify it. And he didn't have science at the time. They didn't have science when Descartes was around, because he was born in the 1500s, if you can imagine that. And he was a French philosopher, and he was what some folks might call a polymath. He was just this absolute paragon of knowledge and learning in all different facets. So let me tell you a little bit about René Descartes. You probably have heard of him before, whether it be through his famous contribution in philosophy, which would be cogito ergo sum. And that's the Latin for I think, therefore I am. We'll talk a bit more about that in a second, but that's probably where you've heard that, I think, therefore I am. You've heard some derivation of it. Humans use it all the time for communication, or as like a premise. It's almost like a proof of thinking. But that's not his only contribution. In fact, he at the time was digging up dead bodies, because they didn't have cadaver labs like we have at CRC, where you could go and learn about anatomy by cutting on an actual human body. A dead human body, that is. But he didn't have that. He had to go rob graves and study it. But he studied anatomy, and he studied the brain. And this was really important. He came up with this concept that, and we'll touch on this more when we do the brain, but that our brain is in contact with our soul. And so Descartes is what's called a dualist. And the problem of minds is that we can't see your mind. We can't see where your mind is. I mean, I can take pictures of your brain. We can use MRIs, fMRIs. I can have you doing something. I have electrodes attached to your brain. We can't see the brain. We can see the activity of the neurons, but we can't see what's going on in the mind. In fact, if I showed you my neural activity now, and you might have somebody else's neural activity, and it would be indistinguishable from one another, but I and that other person might be having very different experiences. So what you want to consider is Descartes was not just a philosopher. He was not just an anatomist. He was a theologian, right? That I think, therefore I am. That was part of a proof that went towards his concept that you could prove God's existence because, in sort of what's called the Platonic unmoved mover, something had to start you thinking, and it wasn't you. He used that as a proof for the existence of God. Again, this guy was just a thinker extraordinaire. That's not all he did. He also was a mathematician. For any of you who have taken any math classes where you use the x and the y axis, you know, the x-axis is the one that goes horizontally, and the y-axis is the one that goes vertically. That concept is called the Cartesian Plane, because René Descartes, Cartesian, invented it. We swim in these waters. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Men and women who have invented and discovered and found out things and thought things that are so helpful to us now. You guys might not like the Cartesian plane. You might not like math. But trust me, it's very useful. And humans have benefited from it for the last, 700 years. 500 years. Excuse my math. Descartes was a polymath. He was so good in all those areas. What we're going to talk about Descartes is really along the lines of something else, which was his philosophy about the mind and the body, called the mind-body problem. The mind-body problem says this: you have a body that's a corporeal nature, right? Your human flesh, including your brain. But then you have this thing called your mind. Now, I'm not sure if you think about it this way, but I feel like I'm more than the cells that make up my body. It's my sense, my individual sense, and anecdotal sense. So again, I can't prove that, but it's the sense that I have is that I am more. Many humans also feel this way. In fact, whenever you ask somebody, what do you think the experience will be like of dying? Okay. They think, well, I, the self, will still be, and yet the body will have ceased to be a biological entity. It will have died and now it will be decaying. They understand that, but they also have this idea that they're going to go on, that there's something else to us more so than this body. Or as Yoda once said, luminous beings we are. That we are full of light, that we are embodied with some sort of joie de vivre, this joy of life, this spirit. And Descartes really believed that. But he was a man of science, again, before science existed. But he wanted to sort of prove this. And so what he said is, well, if there's a body, I know there's a body, and there's a mind, they have to connect. Because the idea is that the mind directs my actions. My hands aren't moving of their own accord now. I'm choosing to move them. And just like my Henry, that's the 9-year-old who asked me about how does the brain get thoughts, he was asking a similar question. What Descartes was struggling with is, where does it exist? Now, Descartes' Judeo-Christian belief was that we had an immortal soul, right? And this is what he might just refer to as the mind. And that the mind had to connect to the body somewhere. If you think of like an RC car or a drone, right? The drone is off flying independently. The RC car is off racing independently, but the controller has a little joystick, little movements where they can move that particular thing, and the connection has to go through radio signals, right? Radio controlled is RC. So Descartes had this concept that your brain was really the receiver portion for the mind that then told the brain what to do, and then your body enacted it. He's called a dualist. Dual meaning that there's a mind and a body, and that the connection was a little bit murky. He didn't really know where that was. He suggested it was your pineal gland, which we'll get to in a bit. It's interesting and wrong, because if I take out your pineal, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to take out your pineal gland, don't worry. But if I did, some people who don't have a pineal gland, it's not like they don't have a soul or a mind, right? They still do. That being said, that leads us to scientific understanding of the brain, which sort of goes against Descartes and says, look, Descartes, this mind, this soul thing that you're talking about, we can't see it. We can't measure it. So we can't say anything about it. The monist view, monist being one, dualist being two, the monist view is that the brain is the mind, that its functioning is the mind, that the interaction of all the neurons is what causes this concept, this sensation I have that I'm more than my corporeal body is just a byproduct of neural activity. Now, I don't know what you think. My guess is that you think that you're more than your body. People have fear of death. And why they have fear of death is that they don't know the answer to this question. Right? If we knew that we were more than this body and this was just a portion of our trip through existence, people wouldn't fear death as much. Now, what's very interesting, and we'll get into this, I think it's chapter 4, anyway, when we talk about drugs, we'll see that death anxiety is actually massively reduced when people have spiritual and mystical experiences induced through several different ways, specifically like entheogens or hallucinogens, psychedelics, drugs. When they trip, it's been shown to reduce death anxiety, clinically, statistically significant reduction in death anxiety through mystical spiritual experiences. Super interesting caveat here. What area of the brain gets affected tremendously by those types of drugs? The pineal gland. Descartes was on to something more than a rudimentary understanding of neuroanatomy. He had something, and maybe he was lucky, but man, the pineal gland turns out to be very important in consciousness, specifically secreting melatonin to make you sleepy, to transition from conscious to unconscious. We'll cover more of that in the future videos on the brain, but Descartes was really onto something, and this is a big issue that we have, which is the mind-body problem of we have this sense of a mind and we have this body and we don't understand necessarily the connection between the two. So the problem of the mind that Descartes has, people independently still get that. My Henry that was asking those questions was just a child considering what he understood about the brain and the body and how it works and going, how's this all work out? While we praise Descartes for his ingenious contributions in science and math and theology and philosophy, we haven't figured it out since, and yet we're still asking those same questions. Now we're going to talk about some of the contributions made by early pioneers in psychology, who I haven't already discussed, and those are the women. Now, if you know anything about history, women in society held different places and functioned in different roles than they currently do. You might think that that's good, If you're critical, you might think that it's good and bad. If you're somebody who's reasonable, you might understand we've made great gains in understanding how to incorporate women's abilities, differences, and capabilities into our modern world to make it a better place. That wasn't the world of early psychological pioneers. And so it was rare that women were making big contributions. That doesn't, however, remove them from the equation. The first woman that we're going to talk about is the woman who started it all, and that's Mary Whitton Clarke. And she was a Harvard student in psychology. She was actually a student of William James, the classic father of American psychology. Her work on personality was very important, but she was denied the ability to get a PhD. This didn't dissuade her from later becoming the first president of the American Psychological Association in, I believe, the 30s. Mary Whitton Clarke was the first female to earn the requirements for a PhD. However, she wasn't granted one. At the time, Harvard College wouldn't allow for women to study or matriculate there, and therefore, despite the fact that she did all the work, she was one of the best students of William James at Harvard. She wasn't allowed to get her PhD. Actually, the first woman that got the PhD was Margaret Flo Washburn. So Margaret Flo Washburn got her PhD from Cornell, which is in one of the Ivy League schools, but it's in New York. As they allowed for women to matriculate there, and so she was the first woman who received her PhD in the field of psychology. Psychology hasn't been as exclusive of a club for the entirety of its existence, but there definitely remained at the time cultural implications for women and cultural obstacles that were not there for men, that they had to overcome if they wanted to pursue their degrees in psychology. One of the first women who became very prominent in the field of psychology was Mammy Phipps Clarke. Now, Mammy Phipps Clarke was the first woman who was black and awarded a PhD in psychology, and she was awarded that from Columbia University, another Ivy League school in New York. She was married to Kenneth Clarke, who, together with he was holding a professorial position at the City University of New York. That's where I came to Cosumnes River College from, as I was teaching at Brooklyn College, which is part of the CUNY system, the City University of New York, CUNY. I never met them. I think they're both dead. There are some other famous people that I'll tell you about that actually were involved at Brooklyn College. But Mammy Clarke made very important contributions to our understanding of what causes children who are exposed to trauma, specifically about racial oppression, what that does to them developmentally over the long haul. She and her husband, Kenneth, reported to the Supreme Court in the landmark decision that was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. In that decision, it was shown that segregation in schools was causing black students to receive inferior education, that it was not a ubiquitously equal playing field for black students in schools, and that they were being told that being black was not as good. She also did some research showing children would choose, even black children would choose to have white dolls rather than having black dolls. And this, they talked about being reasons that internalized racism was affecting the youth of America, that their concept of beauty was that of the public, and that was of a white person rather than that of someone who looked like themselves. And then the idea is that they would not believe themselves to be beautiful. They would not have a good self-concept. That research that she and Dr. Kenneth Clarke did was very important in forming sort of social obligations to development of children and helping think about their self-esteem. We'll talk more about in the future how that went awry and why that went too far, as things often do, and what that led to in terms of the culture where everyone gets a trophy and no one actually knows if anyone's made a contribution. While women were oppressed early in psychological research, they are not today. In fact, 75% of graduate students in psychology and clinical psychology are female. And so we have rectified that, if you believe rectified is 75-25. Or you might think, oh no, 25% male, that means that males are being discriminated against. Again, things are not that simple. Don't have simple ideologies, because simple ideologies are not good for a complex world. But that's the reality, is that we have about 75-25 female to male split in psychology. That might have to do with an intense need for women to use science to understand human emotion and behavior, and that men don't feel the same need in the same way, in the same amount. It's okay to have differences. One of the early women who contributed greatly to the field of psychology was, in fact, Dr. Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. Anna Freud was a collaborator with Dr. Freud and made some very important contributions, including helping to focus on female psyche and to focus on child development. And that's to note, because even back in the late 1800s, women were being able to make contributions to psychology. While they were not able to vote in Western cultures, while they were not able to hold positions or gain college degrees, nothing stopped them from pursuing that. And that's something important to recognize, is that if you feel oppressed, if you are legitimately oppressed like they were, or even if you feel oppressed, the answer to that is not to go, oh, woe is me, and go huddle in a back room somewhere and say, society won't let me contribute. Right? These women, right? Margaret Flo Washburn, Mary Whitton's Clarke, Anna Freud, Mammy Clark, they all contributed greatly despite having massive opposition, despite society saying to them, you don't belong in academia. That's what we tell stories about. Those are the people we tell stories about. Those are the heroes. Because despite their obstacles, despite their oppression, they rose up and they made major contributions. And they changed the game. Because again, 75% of clinical psychology PhDs are now granted to women. So, there you have it. If you're willing to do the work, it's possible to rectify some of the wrongs of the past. But it doesn't come from complaining. It comes from striving harder than anyone else. Harder work. Again, that's going to be throughout this course. It's going to be something that your individual choice to work hard is what can bring you to a new position, rather than some sort of magical solution from policies or research or what scientists find out. It's up to you. You have efficacy. Next, we'll be talking about different perspectives in the field of psychology. The first one that we'll talk about is the psychoanalytic, because that's really the first one that kick-started it off. Now, there were the experimentalists, those are the Tichners and the Wundts, and the functionalists like William James, who initially started psychology by doing really inquiry into sort of human physiology or human reactivity and how fast we could react to things. Yet, that's not where we've sort of come today. The outgrowth really came from Freud's insights about how early childhood experiences, traumas, could affect later adult development, and specifically how underlying unconscious conflict might cause us to avoid things and develop some sort of mechanisms that become maladaptive later. That's the psychoanalytic, and it has this idea that the underlying unconscious conflict is what causes you to have mental illness in the current state, and that once you uncover that, once you lance the wound or go through a process of catharsis, of letting out what it is that bothers you, that solves it. What came up next was what was called the behavioralists. The behavioralists were people who suggested that behavior is only through learned experiences, right? And if you think about this, what I just told you about Plato and Aristotle is the same sort of cycle of understanding of human behavior keeps coming up, which is, one, we're imbued with something early on or innately, as Plato and Freud said, or then later, as B.F. Skinner or J.B. Watson said, oh no, it's all learned, right? Just like Aristotle. So you have this sort of juxtaposition of going back and forth between, again, nature, you're born with it, and nurture, you learn it. This is not something that we've gotten over today, but we have grown into a new understanding, which is that both have clear importance. And we'll talk about epigenetics when we discuss those impacts. But behavioral psychology started with the early behaviorists of J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. You didn't have to have two initial first name to be a behaviorist, but they were, and they really believed that everything was about experiences and learning, and that you were basically a tabula rasa, as John Locke, the ancient British empiricist, once said, that you were born as a blank slate. That was around the time of World War II. After World War II, people had a real sort of come to Jesus moment about human nature. And they realized that there were some nasty parts of human nature that needed to be discussed and uncovered, and that helped and empathized with. And this sort of grew into what is called humanistic psychology. And the goal of humanistic psychology is basically to help people thrive, to help them grow. We've kind of turned back towards humanistic psychology recently. If you're given the right context, if you're given the right relationships, that humans tend to grow in healthy ways. And that perspective was one that was shared by people like Abraham Maslow, people like Carl Rogers. The next iteration that came through, and that was again the 50s, 60s, is really cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology was sort of this, wow, the brain can do all sorts of really cool stuff. Let's measure thinking abilities, memory abilities, because some people have amazing linguistic skills, and savants who can play the piano concertos by hearing it once, and people have these amazing skills. Let's check what the brain's extents or limits are, and that's sort of developed into cognitive psychology. Now, all along the time, in fact, Freud was influenced heavily by the 1856 publication of On Origin of the Species, which is Darwin's great work. Evolutionary psychology began to start, and that idea is something that came to fruition right around the same time as the cognitive psychology revolution after humanism in the 50s and 60s, was this idea that human behavior is a result of a process that naturally selected for it, such that the fittest behaviors in human society were those that got passed down generation to generation, whether it be through gene or through meme. We'll discuss the distinction between those in a bit. But the idea that human behavior was selected for by the process of natural selection and evolution. Evolutionary psychology is this idea that today our current behaviors, what I'm doing now, is a result. The communications I'm having now, the infrastructure of education that we have now today, is because in the past that greatly benefited people, and they were able to survive and thrive and reproduce, right? That's sort of the tripartite monster of evolutionary theories: survive, thrive, and reproduce. Something about our behavior that we're doing now, all the aspects of that in evolutionary psychology's perspective is it has benefit for those things to survive, to thrive, and to reproduce. The next thing we'll talk about is biological psychology. In the 90s, this was back when I was in high school in the early 90s, the big new innovations were happening with neuroimaging. Now, neuroimaging is the way we look at the brain. We'll discuss this in chapter 3. But the revolution of being able to look into the brain while the person is alive, and to look into healthy brains and to see what it's doing, really changed the game for psychologists, because then we were able to sort of say, what are the neural correlates to human behavior? And the 90s was named the decade of the brain. That's biological psychology. What does our biology have to do with it? Now, biological psychology, like all the rest of them, have gone through multiple iterations, and right, so once they go through their course, they kind of morph and they change and then they integrate. And currently, we really think of psychoneuroimmunology, psychoneuroendocrinology is this big field. Psychoneuroendocrinology is this interface between both our endocrine system, the glands that produce hormones and affect our body in massive ways, great areas of tissue, and the brain, which is our neurons, our neural network, which influences our body to move and to do certain things, and where we have our efficacy, our choices to make behaviors, and sort of the influence of those. And then psychologically, it is this sort of perspective of ourself, our learning, our personalities, our proclivities, our limits, our abilities, our merit-based learning that we've done. What that allows us to do is psychoneuroendocrinology. I skipped over one, but it's one that I really feel like is probably one of the most important ones, and that is this idea of social psychology. I skipped over it because it feels more relevant today than ever. It wasn't something that I particularly studied other than through my general psychology courses. But as I began to teach psychology, and I began to investigate the studies that were done in social psychology, what I found is that the most profound impacts on changing behavior have to do with social psychological implications rather than, say, biological ones. Now, biological ones are very important, don't get me wrong. Most complex thing other than the universe is your brain. And so I really do think it's an important area to study. But when we want to understand why people are doing what they're doing and why they're doing things so differently from one another, rather than looking at differences in biology, which are not really there across humans, humans are the same species. We're the same species. So we all have the same underlying biology. What is different is our social context. And when we see the differences in social context, we see that there's a great variation in humans, places that they exist, systems that they exist, relationships that they have for groups of people, and specifically the roles that they feel like they have within that particular context. Social psychology is a perspective that I think you're going to find extremely useful in understanding things that are happening today, in the experiences that you're having today, in the things that the world is confronting today. Social psychology is going to give you those answers.